5 years into our marriage, there we were, sitting across from one another at a quaint little restaurant for our anniversary. A night that was meant to be a celebration. I still vividly remember the day we first crossed paths at a university networking event. Cassandra stood out in the crowd, exuding a blend of confidence and ambition that instantly captivated me. She was more than just attractive. She had a remarkable way with words and a clear vision for her future, particularly her desire to forge a career in business. I felt a sense of pride, honestly. It was like I had found someone with real aspirations, someone not caught up in the typical college daydreams. As we reminisced that night, a sudden realization struck me. Something had shifted. There she was, radiant as ever, recounting our early days, but I could sense she was mentally elsewhere. I remember her laughter as she tried to draw me into an old story, yet it felt superficial. The spark I used to see in her eyes was dimmed. I couldn't pinpoint it right then, but there was an undeniable chasm between us that I couldn't overlook. After that dinner, life rolled on. I immersed myself in work, engaging in the usual projects and lighthearted banter with colleagues about our weekend plans, cracking jokes about achieving that elusive work-life balance. It was all so routine. Cassandra, however, started coming home late more frequently. She explained it away with tales of work, new projects, or major clients they were pursuing. At first, I didn't mind. I admired her ambition and dedication. But then it escalated to every single night. Each time she returned, she seemed different. Her conversations dominated by her boss, Dante. The enthusiasm in her voice was palpable, too palpable. She'd remark on things like, "Dante has this incredible vision," or "Dante knows how to get things done." The way she spoke of him made him sound almost like a deity. I tried not to read too much into it. After all, we had been married long enough that I didn't want to leap to conclusions just because she had a new boss. Yet it began to gnaw at me. I'd sit waiting for her return, hoping for a regular conversation about our day, only to be met with her rhapsodizing about him, her eyes sparkling. Inside, I felt a twist of jealousy, a persistent nagging feeling I attempted to dismiss. "It's just work," I would tell myself. "Don't turn into that guy, Gree." But it didn't stop with the late nights. Cassandra's demeanor began to shift. She meticulously planned out her days, almost down to the last minute. This was new. While she had always been organized, she had never been this regimented. I'd suggest making spontaneous plans, like going out for dinner or spending a quiet weekend together, but she always had an excuse ready. "I have a big presentation coming up," or "I promised Dante I'd help with this project." It was always some work-related excuse, creating a barrier that seemed to exclude me from her life. And then there was her phone. It used to lie casually on the table whenever we were together, but now it was perpetually on silent, always close at hand. She would respond to texts in another room, and if I happened to enter, she'd quickly tuck it away, flashing that "nothing's wrong" smile. The most frustrating part was that whenever I tried to address it, she made me feel paranoid. "It's just work stuff, Gree," she would dismiss, as if my concerns were baseless. But that smile? It felt more like a defensive barrier than a source of comfort, and that knot in my stomach only tightened. One night stands out in my memory. We were having dinner, making an effort to connect like normal, and then she brought up Dante again. But this time it felt different. She went on and on about how impressive he was, how driven and focused he seemed, and how he had accomplished so much in such a short span. The admiration in her voice was unmistakable. And there I sat, nodding along, struggling to suppress a surge of jealousy. The way she spoke about him made it painfully clear that I was now just background noise, something she had left behind without a second thought. After dinner, I attempted to break through the wall that seemed to be forming between us, trying to get her to share what was really going on. I asked her if she felt stressed or overwhelmed with her workload. She merely laughed lightly, as if I were making a mountain out of a molehill. "I've got it all under control, Gree," she said, a confidence bordering on arrogance in her tone. She didn't need my support or concern. She had built her own world, and I felt like an outsider looking in. That's how it struck me, at least, like I was standing behind an invisible barrier she had constructed around herself. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. It's one thing when two people slowly drift apart, but this felt like something unseen was pulling her away, something I couldn't confront or comprehend. And I despised it, loathed the helplessness that consumed me as I lay there. The hardest part was that every time I attempted to bring it up, to spark a conversation, she would just wave me off. I didn't want to seem needy or insecure, but I knew deep down that something was amiss. I felt her slipping away, and all I could do was wallow in my own fears and insecurities. I tried to convince myself it was merely work stress, that she would eventually find her way back to me. But with each passing day, it felt like she was drifting further away, as if I were grasping at something that had already vanished. Honestly, I was terrified of confronting the situation, scared of what I might discover if I did. So, I kept my mouth shut, hoping and waiting. Yet deep inside, I sensed the painful truth. I was losing her. In hindsight, I wonder if I should have addressed it right from the beginning. Maybe if I had just asked her directly, if I hadn't let my doubts eat away at me in silence. But that knot in my stomach grew tighter each day, and then things began to happen that I couldn't dismiss as mere paranoia. It was just another ordinary weeknight. We had decided to share a meal together, something that seemed increasingly rare lately, thanks to her ever-busy work schedule. We were about halfway through our dinner when her phone buzzed. Nothing out of the ordinary, but this time, she grabbed it so quickly that I barely noticed the sound. A fleeting look of anxiety crossed her face as she glanced at the screen. "Who's calling you at this hour?" I asked, attempting to keep my tone casual. She hesitated, not answering right away, which immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. After clearing her throat, she forced a tight smile and replied, "It's just work, Gree." A last-minute question about a project. She lifted her phone, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Her voice was off. There was a waver to it that I couldn't ignore. But before I could inquire further, she stood up, claiming she'd take the call outside to avoid interrupting our dinner. "It'll only be a minute," she assured me as she disappeared down the hallway. A minute turned into a significant stretch of time. Sitting alone at the table, I was engulfed in the silence of the house. My food grew cold, but I didn't pay it any mind. My thoughts were racing in 1,000 different directions, and none of them were positive. When she finally returned, there was an unmistakable air of guilt about her. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but when she sat down, she shot me a look that seemed to dare me to bring it up. So, I let it slide even though I was acutely aware that something was amiss. In the days that followed, those odd calls kept happening. Strange, random interruptions during dinner or at night when we should have been winding down together. Each time, she would answer with that same anxious tone, insisting it was merely work. Yet, there was a crack in her voice that hadn't been there before. I wasn't naive. I understood she was keeping something from me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. So, I decided it was time to do a little sleuthing. I didn't want to be the overly paranoid husband, but I had to know the truth. I casually asked a few friends, just trying to keep it low-key, you know? One of our mutual friends casually mentioned that she had been spending a lot of time with Dante outside of work hours. Apparently, they had even gone out for drinks with a few colleagues. "She's probably just networking," my friend shrugged, brushing it off. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought. I didn't know much about Dante, but I was learning enough to make me uneasy. That's when I realized I needed help. I couldn't just sit idly, marinating in my own suspicions. So I reached out to Oscar. We go way back. He's an old buddy of mine and a private investigator. I figured if anyone could bring me clarity, it would be him. When I shared my concerns, he didn't seem surprised at all. He simply nodded, leaned back in his chair and said, "Gree, let's get you some answers." After discussing it further, he suggested we start with some simple checks, a little surveillance to ensure I wasn't jumping to conclusions. The following days were filled with tension as I anxiously awaited updates from Oscar. Meanwhile, at home, I was doing my best to act normal, but every time I glanced at Cassandra, I felt resentment simmering just beneath the surface. She was my wife, for crying out loud. I shouldn't have to question her loyalty like this. But she wasn't making it easy for me. I'd catch her on her phone, typing away, and the moment I walked in, she'd close it, as if she was hiding something. Every single time. I tried to convince myself it was all work-related, just her way of staying connected to the office. Yet the more I tried to believe that, the more it rang hollow. One evening, I came home to find her lounging on the couch, utterly absorbed in her phone. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I cleared my throat, and she jumped slightly, startled by my presence. "Who are you texting so late?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged and put her phone down a little too hastily. "It's just the office, Gree. You don't need to worry." But her eyes avoided mine, and we both knew she was lying. Anger bubbled within me, but I swallowed it down, playing along like the oblivious husband she probably thought I was. Then came the final straw. One night, she burst through the door, brimming with excitement, talking about an important conference she'd been invited to. She claimed it was a significant opportunity, one that Dante had personally recommended her for. My instinct was to feel happy for her, to support her career ambitions. But something felt off. She offered barely any details, brushing it aside as if it were insignificant. When I probed for specifics, she became defensive, saying it was last minute and that she didn't have all the information yet. She kept it vague, elusive, as if she were determined to keep me in the dark. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I came to the painful realization that I couldn't ignore this any longer. I had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Cassandra was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant dismantling everything we had built together. The day I finally discovered the truth about Cassandra began like any other. Too quiet, almost as if the universe knew something I didn't. Oscar and I had been planning this for a while, and he had finally set up a tracker on her phone. I hated that it had come to this, despised that I had to resort to such measures to find out what my wife was doing. Yet there I was, checking my phone every hour, each notification making my nerves spike. The weekend of the conference finally arrived. She packed a suitcase, tossed in a few dresses, and left with hardly a goodbye, her eyes sparkling with excitement for something I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'll call you when I get there," she promised, flashing a carefree smile. But I knew better than to buy into that facade. My mind was a chaotic mess, torn between fear and denial, but the knot in my stomach had become so familiar that it felt almost like a part of me. As the hours dragged on, I tried to distract myself, but my thoughts were fixated on that tracker, anxiously waiting for it to reveal something, anything, that could provide clarity. I could hardly eat or sleep, and each time I thought about her and Dante, my heart felt as though it was being ripped apart. Late into the first night, I received the notification I had been dreading. The tracker pinged her location, a hotel on the other side of town. Not a conference center, not an office building, a damn hotel. My chest tightened as a sickening realization washed over me. It felt like every doubt I had harbored, every instinct that had nagged at me, had been leading up to this moment. I sank into a chair, staring blankly at the screen, struggling to grasp the reality of it. She was supposed to be at a work event, yet there she was with him. Everything had become painfully clear in that instant. The next morning, Oscar called. He had seen the location too, and I could barely muster the words to express how I felt. "I can't believe this is happening," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Gree, you needed to know. Now we have to consider what happens next." Oscar suggested following them next time to gather undeniable evidence. But I felt I had seen enough. I didn't need more proof. I needed to confront her. I couldn't continue living this lie, pretending everything was okay. When she returned 2 days later, she acted as if nothing had happened. I watched her unpack her suitcase, laughing as she recounted her experience at the conference. She even brought back a cheap souvenir, as if I were the kind of fool who would buy into her story. My anger simmered beneath the surface, but I didn't want to explode just yet. I needed answers. I wanted to hear her try to talk her way out of this one more time. "Did you have a good time?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She glanced at me a little too quickly, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of something. Perhaps guilt? But she quickly plastered on that fake smile and replied, "Of course. It was all work. Actually a bit exhausting." She even yawned, as if to sell me on the idea that she had been running herself ragged for my sake. I didn't want to accuse her outright. I wanted to give her one last chance to come clean. I nodded, looked her squarely in the eyes, and asked, "Was everything just work, Cassandra? Anything else you'd like to share with me?" For a brief moment, she paused, then laughed it off. "Gree, you're being ridiculous. It was a conference. You're really overthinking this." She was lying directly to my face, and I could no longer hold back. She brushed past me, claiming she needed to rest, leaving me standing there, a whirlwind of emotions boiling inside. Later that night, when she had gone to bed, I finally did something I never imagined I would do. I unlocked her phone. She lay there asleep, breathing peacefully as if she had no worries in the world. My hands trembled, but I couldn't stop myself. I scrolled through her messages until I found his name. What I discovered made my stomach drop. They weren't just friendly exchanges or work updates. These were messages that hinted at something much more intimate. There were late-night confessions about how much they enjoyed their time together, and how he couldn't wait to see her again. Some messages were even more explicit, revealing a level of intimacy I'd never experienced with her in a long time. Words and sentiments that had long been absent from our relationship. A crushing weight settled on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Each message felt like a knife twisting deeper into my gut, validating every fear I had harbored. I sat there in the darkness, feeling my world crumble around me. Everything I had believed we shared, every cherished memory and promise, was shattered right before my eyes. She had chosen him over me, lied straight to my face, and betrayed me in the most despicable way, as if I were nothing to her. As much as I wanted to scream or destroy something, I felt utterly empty, hollow, like she had taken everything out of me and left me with nothing. The next day, I went to see Oscar. I recounted everything to him, showed him the damning messages. I didn't need to say much. He could see the pain etched on my face. "Gree," he said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I know this hurts, but we'll get through it together. You're not alone." He suggested we track them down next time to gather concrete evidence, just in case this blew up. But honestly, I didn't care about that anymore. I just wanted to confront her, to force her to face the truth she had been hiding. That evening, I waited until it was just the two of us. I looked her straight in the eye and told her I knew. I revealed that I had seen the messages and knew exactly where she had been and with whom. She didn't even attempt to deny it. Instead, she went pale, like a ghost, and then she became defensive, trying to twist it back on me, asking if I had been spying on her, as if I were the one in the wrong. She tried to justify her actions, claiming it wasn't what it appeared, that Dante and I are just close colleagues, as if I hadn't witnessed the proof with my own eyes. I told her to drop the charade, that I knew everything. For the first time, she looked utterly defeated. Her expression crumbled, and she stood there, speechless. I didn't let her off easily. I told her how she had shattered my trust and dismantled everything we had built together. I unleashed every ounce of anger, every bit of hurt I had been holding back. She attempted to apologize, but it felt empty and meaningless. I didn't want her apologies. I wanted the woman I had married back, the life we had promised each other. But that woman was gone, replaced by a stranger I didn't recognize. Someone who'd torn my heart out and didn't seem the least bit remorseful about it. She went to bed that night, leaving me alone in the living room, staring at the shattered remnants of the life we'd once shared. In that moment, it hit me. I was utterly alone. She was no longer my wife in any meaningful way. I realized that there was no turning back. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. Hitting rock bottom leads to thoughts and actions you never imagined you'd entertain. After my last confrontation with Cassandra, I was done. I couldn't let her escape the consequences, not after all the lies, the deceit, and the way she had treated me like a fool in my own home. But I wasn't going to wallow in anger. No, I had a plan designed to strike where it would hurt the most. I called Sandra, her mother. I wasn't entirely sure what I would say, but I knew I wanted her to witness the wreckage Cassandra had left behind. She picked up on the first ring, and I invited her over, mentioning that I could use some company. I need someone to talk to, Sandra. Someone who understands what Cassandra and I had. I didn't need to elaborate further. She agreed to come over that evening without hesitation. When Sandra arrived, she looked as though she had endured her own personal hell. She must have sensed the changes in Cassandra too, the growing distance between us. She hugged me tightly, and I felt an odd comfort, as if she were one of the last people who understood what Cassandra and I used to share. We sat down, poured a couple of glasses of wine, and began to talk. For the first time in months, I felt open, free to express what I really felt. She listened attentively, nodding and sometimes shaking her head in disbelief, but always showing the kind of sympathy that Cassandra had long since stopped offering. We reminisced about the good old days, times when Cassandra and I were genuinely happy, before Dante, before all the deceit. And as we shared memories, I felt an unexpected connection with Sandra. She was warm and caring, genuinely there for me, which was more than I could say for Cassandra. The wine loosened us both, and somewhere along the way, our casual conversation deepened. With a sigh, Sandra leaned back, her eyes glistening. "Gree, you didn't deserve this. You've been nothing but good to her." I honestly don't know where I went wrong as her mother. Her gaze dropped, clearly pained, sharing in the betrayal I felt. Without realizing it, I reached for her hand, and she looked at me with a softness that nearly broke me. We held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I felt something unspoken pass between us. I pulled her close, and for a brief moment we lingered like that, two people wounded by the same betrayal. But then, something shifted. Her hand rested on my shoulder while mine found its way to her back, and before I could think it through, our lips met. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. We surrendered to the moment. All the anger, the hurt, the loneliness, it all melted away, replaced by something fierce and primal that I hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. We completely lost ourselves, wrapped up in this strange, forbidden intimacy. I won't deny it, it felt good in ways I can't even begin to articulate. She was there, fully present, offering me something Cassandra had long since stolen from me. In that instant, I didn't care about the consequences. The pain, the betrayal. All of it faded into the background, overshadowed by this raw, undeniable connection. The next morning, I awoke with a mix of guilt and satisfaction. What I had done felt wrong, yet somehow justified. I felt alive, something I hadn't experienced in years thanks to Cassandra. I knew how devastated she would be if she found out. I understood it would shatter her the way she had shattered me, and that was exactly what I wanted. So I made up my mind to tell her. I wanted her to experience the same anguish, the same shock that had ripped through me when I uncovered her betrayal. I waited until she got home that evening and then, with as much composure as I could muster, I laid it all out. I didn't hold back. I detailed the night I had spent with her mother. Every kiss, every touch, every moment. I watched as her face went pale, her mouth falling open in disbelief. "How could you?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "With my mother? Are you out of your mind?" I shrugged, letting the bitterness seep through my words. "How could you, Cassandra? With Dante, after everything we had?" I refused to let her play the victim. She had brought this upon herself, and now she was finally facing the consequences of her betrayal. She erupted in anger, blaming me for everything, calling me sick and pathetic. I stood there, calm, observing her unravel. I told her flat out that she had destroyed our relationship long before I did anything with Sandra. "You think I wanted to go there?" I asked. "You think I wanted to hurt you?"
No, Cassandra.
"But you hurt me first, time and time again. Now, I'm just returning the favor." Her face flushed, her eyes blazing with fury and disbelief. She kept shouting, demanding answers, wanting to know how I could betray her like this. I met her gaze and said, "This is what happens when you push someone too far, Cassandra. This is the price of your lies and betrayal. You lost me the moment you chose him over us." She fell silent, staring at me as if she no longer recognized the man in front of her. And maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself either. But I felt free at last, unburdened by the weight of pretending and holding everything inside. Ultimately, I confronted her, declaring that our marriage was finished, that we could never return from this. She attempted to argue, to convince me that we could somehow salvage what was left, but I was done listening. "There's nothing left to save, Cassandra," I said, my back turned to her. She stood there, paralyzed, as I walked out of the room, leaving her alone to grapple with the reality of her choices. For the first time in what felt like ages, a sense of calm washed over me. I was finished with her deceit, her betrayals. Though revenge hadn't solved everything, it had granted me the closure I desperately needed and the courage to step away. As I walked away from her, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever was to come next would be my opportunity to start anew, to construct a life free from the burden of her betrayal. The divorce process loomed ahead of me, and while I didn't relish it, I recognized it as a necessary step. Following the explosive fallout from my night with Sandra and the confrontation with Cassandra, I understood that turning back was no longer an option. Any love or trust we once shared was long gone, buried beneath layers of deception and resentment. Walking into my lawyer's office, I experienced an unsettling mix of relief and sorrow. The relief came from reclaiming control, finally breaking free from the shackles of our union. But there was sadness too, mourning for what we had lost. The life we built, the memories we had forged together. As flawed as it had been, it had once felt genuine. Settling into my lawyer's office, I quickly realized just how tangled things would become. This was more than simply signing a few documents. We had assets, a home, and the remnants of a shared life that needed to be divided. He outlined the process, detailing what I could expect, the documents required, and the inevitable court sessions ahead. I braced myself for what was sure to be a brutal experience. Our first court session was nothing short of a disaster. As soon as the judge began discussing our assets, Cassandra's demeanor shifted. She seemed composed initially, almost cordial, but as soon as the conversation turned to finances and property, her true nature emerged. She wanted the house, most of our savings, and anything else she could claim. Before long, accusations began to fly across the table. She was intent on casting me as the villain, claiming I had destroyed our marriage, conveniently glossing over her own affair with Dante. "You're the one who couldn't hold it together, Gree," she shot back during one of our heated exchanges, venom dripping from her voice. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. "Are you really blaming me? After everything you've done? You threw us away for Dante, Cassandra. You lied, you betrayed me, and now you want to play the victim." But she wouldn't accept responsibility. To her, it was all my fault, an easier narrative for her to spin, I suppose. Our arguments devolved into emotional battlegrounds, dredging up every single issue we had ever faced. It was exhausting, infuriating. There were moments when I wanted to throw in the towel, to escape it all, but I reminded myself why I was fighting. I refused to let her walk away with everything after all she had put me through. Through this tumultuous time, Oscar and a few close friends became my lifelines. They understood what I was enduring and did their best to help me navigate the storm, even if just for a moment. Oscar organized weekend retreats to the mountains or simple escapes to break free from reality. Those weekends felt like therapy sessions. Hours of me venting while they listened, offered advice, or simply reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. One night, gathered around a campfire with a few beers, I finally shared my fears, the doubts that haunted me when the sun went down. "What if I'm just broken after this?" I confessed, staring into the flickering flames. "What if I can't trust anyone again?" Oscar placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You're not broken, Gree. You're hurt, sure, but not broken. You'll get through this." His words offered me a glimmer of hope, more than he probably realized. However, as supportive as my friends were, each court session drained me further. Every small victory, like securing joint property rights or retaining some of our savings, came at a steep emotional cost. Cassandra resisted every step of the way, her fury intensifying with each ruling that didn't go her way. There was no room for compromise. It was all-out war. I began seeing a psychologist to help process everything. I needed to work through the anger, frustration, and pain that kept bubbling to the surface. Therapy became my sanctuary, a space where I could unpack my emotions without judgment, a place where I could admit my fears about the uncertain future ahead. The sessions were challenging, peeling back the layers of betrayal and disappointment, but they were also cathartic. I discussed my hopes for the future, the dreams I hesitated to chase. The psychologist encouraged me to take it one day at a time, to concentrate on rebuilding myself instead of worrying about what could happen down the line. After what felt like an eternity of court dates and painful discussions, we finally reached the end of this chapter. Cassandra and I sat across from each other in the lawyer's office. The final divorce papers spread before us. She looked worn and drained, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of the woman I once loved. But that was just a ghost of the past. What we had was irrevocably lost, and I wasn't about to let nostalgia cloud my judgment. The lawyer asked for our signatures, and I took a deep breath, signing my name with each stroke of the pen, feeling like a weight lifted from my shoulders. Cassandra signed as well, her expression one of indifference. She didn't look at me as she handed the papers back to the lawyer, nor did she say a word as she gathered her belongings. I stood up, feeling like I had just completed a marathon, completely drained yet exhilarated. At that moment, I finally felt free. As I stepped out of the office, the cool air kissed my face, and I inhaled the deepest breath I had taken in months. The weight of anger and bitterness seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense of tranquility I hadn't felt in ages. This was it, my new beginning. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't terrify me. It felt like an open road ahead, and I was ready to tackle whatever came next. Once the dust from the divorce settled, I found myself at an unfamiliar crossroads. The life I once knew had vanished, and for the first time, I was solely responsible for my own happiness. It was a little daunting, but I knew I couldn't allow the bitterness stemming from Cassandra to define me. I had been granted a second chance, a clean slate, and I was determined not to waste it. It was time to focus on myself. I had invested so much energy into our relationship, trying to mend something that was already broken. Now it was my turn to flourish. I enrolled in several career development courses, attended seminars, and even dove into workshops. I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go, but I figured that the more skills I acquired, the more opportunities would arise. Having something constructive to focus on felt refreshing, something that wasn't tethered to my past. A few months into this new chapter, a promising opportunity came my way at a new company. It was a true fresh start, surrounded by people who had no knowledge of my previous struggles. That sense of liberation was intoxicating. It was there that I met Isabella. She joined just weeks after I started, and we found ourselves collaborating on a project together. I vividly remember our first conversation. She exuded a quiet strength, an unspoken resilience that resonated with me immediately. As we got to know one another, we discovered we shared more in common than we anticipated. She too had faced her share of struggles and heartbreaks. She opened up about her dreams, her fears, and the losses she had endured. For the first time since Cassandra, I felt a genuine connection. A camaraderie built on openness that was free from lies and ulterior motives. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something deeper, cultivated slowly through shared conversations and experiences. Isabella and I began spending more time together outside of work. We would go out for dinner, engage in lengthy discussions over wine, and I found myself eagerly anticipating each meetup. On weekends, we ventured on small trips, exploring new places together. We even started attending business events as a duo, bouncing ideas off each other and supporting one another's aspirations. She wasn't merely a distraction or a rebound. She was someone who understood me in a way that felt real. As my relationship with Isabella flourished, I recognized that I still had work to do on myself. I continued my sessions with my psychologist, addressing the remnants of my anger, doubts, and fears. Therapy wasn't always easy. Some days, I left feeling emotionally drained, like I had reopened old wounds. Yet slowly, I began to feel lighter, stronger. I returned to sports, took up running, and even joined a local gym. Physical activity became my outlet, a way to channel my emotions and find my footing. I also began to rebuild the relationships I had neglected during my marriage. I reached out to old friends, reconnected with family, and realized how much support was available to me. I hadn't truly been alone. I had simply been too engulfed in my pain to notice the love surrounding me. The people in my life welcomed me back with open arms. Still, there were moments when memories of Cassandra and the betrayal crept back in. At times, I would feel the sting of hurt and the anger bubbling up again. However, each time it seemed a little less intense. I reminded myself that she was merely a chapter in my story, a chapter that had closed. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how much power it held over my future. One evening, Isabella and I sat on a hill, watching the sunset after a long hike. We were far from distractions, just the two of us enjoying the quiet. As I gazed out over the horizon, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on my skin, I reflected on how far I had come. The life I left behind, the pain and heartache, was part of my journey, part of what had led me here. I turned to Isabella, and she smiled at me, as if she could read my thoughts. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. I had discovered something genuine, something rooted in trust, respect, and understanding. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone or anything take away my happiness again. I was done looking back. My life lay ahead of me, waiting to be lived. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the landscape, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace envelop me. This was my new beginning, my chance to start fresh with a clean slate. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and embraced the future, ready to face whatever awaited me.